So Space Marine Scouts have certainly fallen from glory somewhat in 40k 9th edition. Let's talk about them as a unit and whether there's any use cases for them in a strong Space Marine list. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where today we're talking about those Space Marines in training, the chapter neophytes that are the Space Marine Scouts. I'd argue that these guys are the unit that lost out the most in the translation between the 8th and 9th edition codexes, really taking a hammering from a few different angles, no longer being troops choices, and now being the only Space Marines that only have one wound as opposed to having two or more. I think perhaps Games Workshop's intention was to try and make them a bit more of a niche unit, as opposed to a unit that appeared in almost every second Space Marine army list, as in general their utility was just so much better than tactical marines, mainly for that forward deployment. They certainly do seem to have achieved that, unfortunately. They do seem to have made the scouts so niche that almost no one is taking them, which isn't exactly great either. In any case, in the video we'll take a look over their datasheet, compare their damage and durability versus their competitors, have a few words about their buffs and synergy on the table, and then sum up with a bit of an overview. So to start with then, Scouts are now an Elite's choice in Codex Space Marines. I can see why they have been moved to the Elite's role, basically to make them not quite as much of a core battle line unit, but it certainly does feel like a bit of a misnomer. They're certainly a less elite than standard tactical Marines, yet they share a slot with Terminators. It does make them a lot less attractive than they were previously, not filling out detachments quite as easily, and not getting OBSEC, certainly a big point in the favour of Incursors and Infiltrators. Their stat line is largely quite similar to tactical Marines. They hit on 3s, not 4s as they used to in codexes past, but they only have 1 wound rather than 2, and only have a 4+ armor save rather than the 3+ of power armor. At base they're equipped with a bolt pistol and bolt gun, and frag and crack grenades. Now Scouts really have quite a lot of weapon options. They can swap out those standard issue bolt guns for combat blades and bolt pistols. That can give you a bit more of a melee-centric squad. The combat blade gives you an extra attack, but it doesn't get you the AP-1 of the Astartes chainsword. Could be nice for Blood Angels or White Scars perhaps. You can also swap the bolt gun for the Astartes shotgun, an 18-inch range assault 2 weapon with strength 4, AP 0 and damage 1. Kind of much of a muchness with the bolter really, fairly even as to whether or not it's going to be more efficient or less efficient. They may be quite good with certain chapters, particularly White Scars, who can advance and shoot it at full ballistic skill and then still go on to charge if they want to. The next option is the Scout Sniper Rifle, which costs an extra 2 points per model, so we're up to 16 points rather than 14. 36-inch range with a heavy one-shot at strength 4, AP -1 and damage 1. Of course it ignores Lookout Sir, and every 6 to wound causes a mortal wound as well. It's quite nice that they did gain an extra pip of AP on this, but as we'll see in a second, they don't really compare amazingly against Space Marine Eliminators, who at their new points cost do just seem to be a fair bit more efficient for the sniping. The Scout Sergeant can take combi weapons, pistol weapons and melee weapons, most of which are a little bit overpriced for me, but at the very least I'd replace his bolt pistol with a chainsword. He can still have a chainsword and a bolter, so it's a bit better in close combat. He can take a heavy bolter or a missile launcher for 10 points or 15 points respectively. Both of them are kind of okay, but I'm not really convinced that the Scout Squad is the most efficient platform for them. And finally, the entire squad can take camo cloaks, that's an extra 2 points per model, and basically if they're receiving the benefit of cover against a ranged attack, they get an additional 1 to their saving throw, potentially for a 2-up cover save if they happen to be in light cover, which would certainly help keep them alive just that little bit longer. In general, I think I'd normally consider the camo cloak if I was taking the sniper rifles. If they're going with any of the more short-range aggressive options, I'm not really sure the extra points are going to be worth it, as they're likely to want to get stuck into the enemy rather than just parking up and hide in a ruin. Finally, they have a fair few special rules above and beyond the normal Space Marine ones. Concealed positions can allow them to set up in the midfield, probably their most powerful innate ability, allowing you to grab those objectives from turn 1 and skirmish with enemies trying to do the same. Outflank to allow them to set up in reserve and turn up from one of the board edges later in the game, though to be honest if you are going for reserves I tend to want something a bit more hard hitting. With Space Marines having access to Vanguard veterans and Terminators and things, I feel like the Scouts struggle to compete for this role. Finally, they do also have the smokescreen keyword. That does allow them to use 1 command point to be -1 to hit, and that can be fairly relevant if they are targeted by anything with fairly low ballistic skill, say Imperial Guardsmen hitting on 4s or Orcs hitting on 5s. I think with the 1 wound that Scouts have it's not always going to make the difference, but in the right circumstances it could be handy. So overall, clocking in at 14 points per model, Scouts are cheap, light skirmish infantry. In most of the loadouts, they're going to be good at skirmishing with enemy light infantry, though you could try and deck them out for ranged combat with some sniper rifles and maybe a heavy weapon. First up, let's compare them to a few competitors in terms of damage and durability. Firstly, if we equip them with combat blades or bolters, in general from their shooting and melee they will tend to do a little bit more damage than their equivalent points cost in the tactical space marines and intercessors. They do have at least a reasonably similar stat line, and cost around a third less, depending on exactly what you're comparing them to out of the troops section. For the points cost, their damage really isn't all that bad for their skirmishing type role. However, it really is in durability where they tend to fall down a bit. Just for equivalent points cost, say if we compared 7 scouts for 98 points to 5 incursors for 105 points, they're both fairly similarly durable to something like overcharged plasma, which is great at killing 2 wound space marines, but if you turn some light anti-infantry firepower on them, then they're going to be far easier to remove with something like bolt rifles. Those scouts will take around about 20 bolt rifle hits to bring them down, where the incursors will take around about 40, almost double the durability against light infantry fire, and that is kind of a problem within the greater context of the Space Marine army, with Space Marines across the board basically having 2 wounds in the power armor now. Small arms fire really isn't that big a deal to them, but it is a massive deal to the scouts, so any small arms that the opponent is going to have is going to get trained straight on them as a priority. Against ranged fire at least, you could make the scouts at least a little bit more efficient by giving them camo cloaks, but I would bear in mind that costs them an extra 2 points, and they're only going to get any benefit of that when hugging cover. If we compare them to incursors still, they'll still be getting a 2+ armor save when in cover just thanks to their power armor, and of course as well as smokescreen, they do have the option of transhuman physiology as well, so they do have the potential to be even more durable even against heavy weapon fire. I think whichever way you slice it, Scout's main issue is that they're just really quite easy to remove compared with the other types of Space Marine. Finally, if we do take a look at their sniper variant versus their Primaris rivals, the Eliminators, there really isn't all that much contest, I'm afraid. If we compare 160 points of Scouts with sniper rifles, and we haven't even sprung for the camo cloaks to keep them safe, they do around about 4 or 5 wounds to an Imperial Guard equivalent character, or around 1 to 1.5 wounds to a standard Space Marine character. If you compare that to 150 points worth of Eliminators firing mortis rounds, it's more like 7 or 8 wounds to the Guard character, or a pretty whopping 5 wounds to the Space Marines, seeing as the Eliminators can get up to some fairly phenomenal saves as well. In cover they have a 2+ with a +1 to their save on top of that. I just really don't think that there's much comparison between them and the Scouts for the sniper role. Moving on, let's talk briefly about buffs and synergies for the Scouts, and starting out with chapter tactics. Perhaps one of the most interesting ones for the snipers are the Raven Guard, whose super tactical doctrine could actually make the Scout sniper rifles somewhat efficient. You get a +1 to hit for them and a +1 to wound, and it's arguably better on the sniper scouts than the Eliminators, both because they can actually be buffed up to a ballistic skill 2+, where the Eliminators already have it, and because their lower strength guns actually get more out of the +1 to wound. They also get the benefit of cover out in the open, so they make the camo cloaks a bit more efficient as well. I'm still not necessarily saying that they beat the Eliminators like this, but they maybe narrow the gap just a little bit. Otherwise, Ultramarines are always quite good fun to use with forward deploying units, using their stratagem to either deploy aggressively or redeploy further back, depending on who gets first turn. They do also have access to Sergeant Telion, who can give them a 2+ ballistic skill as well, which I guess if you do want to try and make the absolute most out of a unit of scouts, that could be one way. Otherwise, as we mentioned, melee chapters could get a bit out of the more close-range loadouts, shotguns or combat blades. A charge from a Blood Angel's scout squad could be actually surprisingly potent turn 1, and Space Wolf scouts actually get a few additional options as well, such as taking power axes or power swords on regular models. I'm not sure that's necessarily a point-sufficient idea, but it does make the unit maybe a bit more threatening in combat. Black Templars also can run them a bit interestingly, as they mix and match squads within their Crusader squad. For me though, with just how cheap initiates are right now, I would just literally take lots of initiates for only 15 points. I don't think that the paired competence rule to get some reroll ones is really worth taking neophytes along. I don't think I generally bother supporting scouts with characters at all. Generally their job is to screen and die, not deal damage, but I suppose you could get some opportunistic rerolls on some sniper scouts if you've got them, though I wouldn't let them distract you from the main purpose of your list. Scouts can take the Landspeeder Storm as a transport, which despite being a dedicated transport for scouts, is quite often run competitively all on its own, just literally as a very fast moving, somewhat tough objective snatcher that can zoom a pretty crazy distance and either stand in a table quarter, contest an objective or do a nuisance charge, while packing at least a little bit of anti-infantry fire. I think the problem with using it with scouts is that you kind of make the scouts' main advantage, the forward deployment, kind of moot, because you have to set this up in the deployment zone, and it means that the scouts can't use their signature ability. Finally, stratagems wise, I'd say perhaps the best value one is that smokescreen one, making them -1 to hit for 1 command point. I guess if you do take heavy weapons, you could think about Hellfire or flak missiles, or the 2 command point one for shooting while doing actions if you absolutely need maximal damage, while they do get to work on doing something else. Overall, I'd say the best use for scouts would probably be armed with either shotguns or bolters, maybe as a bit more of a budget forward deployment unit compared with infiltrators or incursors. 70 points isn't terrible for a unit that sets up in the midfield, even if that unit isn't particularly tough or going to deal an enormous amount of damage. Even so though, if you are looking for just a really cheap squad that sets up in the midfield, they do actually have some fair competition from eliminators now, which are 75 points for the unit. A fair bit tougher against quite a lot of types of fire, and of course have decent sniper fire and reasonable melee prowess as they are Primaris Marines. Overall though, I think if all the other options didn't exist, then scouts would most likely be taken in Space Marine lists, as setting up outside the deployment zone really can be worth the price of admission. However, I do think that between infiltrators, incursors and eliminators, other things just seem to do what scouts do better. In particular incursors, they're pretty good in melee, really quite tough with their 2 wounds, power armor and transhuman physiology access, and of course they have the all-important objective secured, which is a nice thing as well. I think in one way or another scouts could use a bit of a boost to make them a bit more of a viable choice. I guess there is always the option of just making them a bit cheaper in points, maybe at 12 or 13 points they'd be worth a look a bit more. Or maybe you could make them a troops choice again and then just arbitrarily limit their numbers a bit, maybe similar to what say Death Guard get with cultists. Say you can only take 1 scout squad per other troops choice that you have in the army. That might at least encourage them not to be spammed quite as much. If the sniper rifles are going to compete against the newer cheaper eliminators, they would need a bit of a tune-up. I'd say either going to strength 5 or AP -2 could both be reasonable options, but they're just not an efficient or reliable choice for killing characters at the moment. Finally, maybe to fit in with the rest of the Space Marine army, you could think about even raising their points a bit and giving them 2 wounds like the rest of the Space Marines, but just retaining their 4+ armor save. Plenty of options, and I'm not necessarily saying do all of them, but I think they're one of the many Space Marine units that is just very unlikely to be taken compared with the other options available. So let me know what you think. Have you put scouts on the table in 9th edition, and if so, how did it go? Look forward to hearing your opinions down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video and you'd like to see more, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out pretty much every day. We'll have plenty more Space Marine content on the channel. Finally, if you would like to help keep these videos coming, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well. You can find that down in the video description below, and it is what allows me to spend quite so much time making videos about model soldiers for you guys to watch. If you would like to help keep the channel's content coming, any support is enormously appreciated. I do try and reward channel patrons as much as I can, new videos early each week, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.